Needless to say, the Battle of the River Plate is one of the most famous naval battles in history, where three British cruisers boxed in the German raider Graf Spee, ultimately forcing her to shelter in neutral harbor, where the Panzerschiff would be scuttled rather than surrender. I've previously covered one of the ships involved that day in Graf Spee herself, along with HMS Cumberland, one of the cruisers sent to reinforce the British. For today's video, we'll be covering another British-built cruiser, with emphasis on built because HMNZS Achilles was crewed by New Zealanders, as she fought Graf Spee, something that citizens of New Zealand understandably look on with pride, then and now. Following her battle with Graf Spee, Achilles would continue to serve under the New Zealand flag, from patrolling the Atlantic to fighting off of Guadalcanal. She wouldn't join her Australian cousin Perth in the Java Sea, or the other Australian cousin Sydney in the Mediterranean, but she gave good service in other theaters of operation, at least up to early 1943. Severe damage off of Guadalcanal would largely take her out of the war, at least when it came to direct combat operations. On the other hand, Achilles would end up enduring for a very long time. She was initially returned to the British in late 1946, who then sold her on to the new Indian Navy in the summer of 1948. Achilles, now renamed INS Delhi, would remain in Indian service for 30 years. But for today, we'll be focusing on Achilles' service. Her service as Delhi is, I feel, important enough for a dedicated video. For the moment, we'll start with the day the ship was laid down. That came on June 11th, 1931, with the new cruiser launched a little over a year later on September 1st, 1932, and then commissioned another year later on October 10th, 1933. At this point, she bore the name HMS Achilles. In common with Perth, Hobart, and Leander, Achilles would initially serve with the Royal Navy. Also, in common with those ships, there's not a huge amount written on the pre-war service. So, with that in mind, I'll detour to the design real quick before covering what I could find on the early service. In this regard, Achilles was a member of the Leander-class cruisers. I've previously covered both Perth and Sydney, which were modified members of that group. Achilles was part of the first group, along with HMS Orion. The easiest way to tell the two apart is in the funnel. The modified Leanders, or the Amphion class, had two funnels. The original 5 ships had a single larger funnel. This was due to having all the boiler rooms arranged to trunk through one stack, whereas the Amphions had a more traditional distributed power plant. With that out of the way, let's start the design details with the displacement. Citing Friedman, Achilles displaced 6,907 tons at the light loading, with her deep load going up to 9,140 tons. Which brings us to the weaponry. While the power plant varied between the groups, the firepower didn't. From Leander to Sydney, this consisted of the same layout. 8 6-inch, 152mm guns in 4 twin turrets, carried in a traditional layout. A super firing pair on the bow and a super firing pair on the stern, with the secondary battery consisting of 4 single 4-inch, 102mm guns clustered amidships. These would later be replaced on a 1-to-1 basis by twin 4-inch mountings. These were dual-purpose weapons, regardless of the number, intended to engage both destroyers and aircraft, while direct anti-aircraft weaponry came in the form of quad 50 caliber machine guns, at least at first. This would be reinforced over the course of their service with both 20mm cannon and 40mm guns. Achilles would actually have a turret removed to carry even more of those weapons. Admittedly, in her case, because that turret was already damaged, with the weaponry rounded off by 2 quadruple torpedo mounts, for a total of 8 tubes and 8 torpedoes, which rounds off the weaponry, allowing us to move on to armor protection, which for Achilles consisted of a 4-inch thick main belt, with a deck of 1¼ inches in thickness. Not the most heavily armored ship out there, but definitely not the worst. With all of this capable of 32.5 knots on 73,000 shaft horsepower. And this rounds off the design. Now to look at where Achilles served under the British flag before shifting to New Zealand service. As previously noted, this began on October 10th of 1933, with the then HMS Achilles joining the home fleet, where the ship would remain for the next 2 years. In this, she followed the same pattern as most British cruisers of the time period. A stint with the home fleet, then reassignment to some foreign station or another. In Achilles' case, she lasted 2 years with the home fleet from late 1933 to late 1935, with the most notable event being the Silver Jubilee of King George V in 1935, along with the attendant fleet review. Otherwise, it was a fairly quiet period to match a quiet period in overall world affairs. In any case, by November of 1935, Achilles was set for her foreign station of some description. In this case, that meant a refit in November 1935 to sail for New Zealand. The cruiser's British crew departed to be replaced by a crew mostly made up of New Zealanders. Achilles recommissioned with that crew on March 31st of 1936. However, it should be noted that it was just the crew. The ship was still HMS Achilles and still part of the Royal Navy. She had simply shifted to the New Zealand Squadron. The Royal New Zealand Navy, as an independent force, did not yet exist. That detour aside, Achilles set sail. Initially, this saw her work up in the Mediterranean, with the cruiser ultimately arriving in New Zealand at the end of the year in September 1936, where things would continue on the usual pattern, training and patrol duty for the most part, with this continuing until April 1938. It might have continued right on through to 1939, but Achilles had the misfortune to collide with a merchantman on April 14th of 1938. That necessitated returning to Britain for repair work, which kept the ship in dock until March 1939. This is mostly noteworthy because it means Achilles had basically just returned to New Zealand when war broke out in September of 1939. In fact, with war clouds gathering, Achilles left New Zealand on August 29, 1939. Under Royal Navy control, the cruiser sailed for the West Indies station, although she would never actually get there. The ship remained on the west coast of the Americas, at least at first. Achilles spent September patrolling off the South American coast. When this was done, Achilles was reassigned. She was seen as more necessary in the Atlantic. As such, the cruiser sailed around South America before rebasing at the Falklands. She arrived there in late October 1939, at which point Achilles joined Force G for hunting German shipping in the South Atlantic. In this, she joined HMS Exeter on October 26th, with HMS Cumberland joining on the 27th. Achilles would then spend November on unsuccessful hunting for German shipping. Even at this stage of the war, there wasn't much German merchant traffic to hunt, although there was Graf Spee lurking between the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, which is important because Achilles would fight her first battle in December 1939 against the aforementioned Graf Spee. This came on December 13th, 1939, in the Battle of the River Plate. Now, I've covered this battle in more detail in my video on Graf Spee. As such, I'll give the short version here. Aware that the German raider was in the area, Force G, under Commodore Henry Harwood, had set up off Montevideo. They arrived there on December 10th under the assumption the Germans would move in that direction, which they did, spotting the British forces on December 13th, at which point Graf Spee, in dire need of an overhaul, charged the British cruisers. Captain Langsdorff recognized his ship was in no shape to outrun British cruisers. By closing the range, he hoped he could force the British into a straight fight, which, in fairness, he did do. Achilles and Ajax split off to the northeast, while Exeter turned northwest. That bracketed Graf Spee and forced her to split her fire, in theory. In practice, the Germans focused on Exeter with their big guns, while the smaller secondary battery engaged the pair of Leanders. Exeter would be heavily damaged by this. Ultimately, all three of her turrets were disabled, while Graf Spee was peppered by return fire. The British light cruisers charged in themselves, forcing Langsdorff to divert his fire, and likely saving Exeter as she pulled back. Graf Spee's return fire would do notable damage to Ajax, while Achilles largely avoided damage. She only suffered some minor splinter damage to her bridge structure. Achilles lost 4 men, with her captain wounded, despite at times closing within 5 miles of the Germans. Regardless, once Graf Spee was in harbor, Achilles' battle came to its end. She patrolled off the coast just on the chance the Germans made a break, which they wouldn't. Ultimately, Graf Spee would be scuttled off Montevideo on December 17th, rather than face internment or further battle with the British. Achilles, for her part, rounded out 1939 on further patrol duty, something that continued through January 1940, with Achilles departing the area soon after to return to New Zealand by the end of February. This saw the cruiser under refit from the start of March until the middle of June 1940. It's at this point that Achilles' service became rather uneventful. For the rest of 1940, all of 1941, and most of 1942, the cruiser remained far away from active combat. While other light cruisers fought in the Mediterranean, Achilles was kept close to home. She spent those years on one of 2 duties: convoy escort and hunting German raiders. I don't want to sound like this was an important duty. It most certainly was. Achilles just didn't see any combat, with the most notable event coming on October 1st, 1941, with the official formation of the Royal New Zealand Navy. It's at this point that the ship became HMNZS Achilles. Not that much would change for her service. The rest of 1941 continued on with more convoy escorts, including the American Pensacola convoy in late December. Achilles met up with Pensacola on December 19, 1941. Now, with a new enemy in Japan, Achilles might have seen more combat. As it turned out, she wouldn't. Achilles spent 1942 on more convoy escort duty, with the exception of a stint with USS Lexington in February. She didn't fight in the East Indies, and she also wouldn't participate in the initial actions off Guadalcanal in August 1942. In fact, she didn't see much in the way of direct combat with Japan until the start of 1943, where Achilles would suffer some unfortunate damage in her first real action against the Japanese. The cruiser was operating with American forces in January 1943, during which she provided gunfire support on January 5th. Which saw the group attacked by Japanese aircraft. Achilles would suffer badly here. A Japanese bomb hit her directly in X turret, the aft super-firing mount. This blew the top off the turret, leading to the loss of 13 men. This damage was severe. Severe enough that Achilles, after emergency repair work, sailed to Britain in March, where she would go in for a refit that should have lasted until probably fall of 1943. Except in the course of this, Achilles had an explosion in an empty fuel tank on June 22, 1943. This caused severe structural damage and killed 14 men. The cruiser would, as a direct result, remain in refit until August 1944. Well, technically May, but machinery issues put her back in dock. Of course, by August 1944, the war was mostly over. Achilles was still sent back to the Pacific when her refits concluded in mid-August. However, further machinery issues would dog the ship all the while. A boiler room fire on September 5th required more time in dock at Ceylon, with these repairs lasting until early December 1944, while early 1945 was spent on convoy escorts and yet another refit from March through April. Once this was done, Achilles would round out the war, escorting aircraft carriers and bombarding Japanese positions. Fortunately, she avoided further damage during this, although it was a relatively quiet end to what began as an eventful wartime career. The cruiser would round off her service with New Zealand as a guard ship in Tokyo in October 1945, before being transferred to the Royal Navy on September 17, 1946, although this was more a formality than anything else. The cruiser was transferred on to the new Indian Navy on July 5, 1948, as INS Delhi, where she went from an aging cruiser to one of the most powerful warships in the fleet, something that saw Delhi in service for 30 years. However, that's a story for another video. I'll end things here with her scrapping. This came in 1978 bringing an end to a 45-year career. It's a shame she was in refit for so much of the Second World War. Achilles was a fighting ship, denied the chance to fight in a lot of ways. Graf Spee demonstrates just how well this ship and crew could fight when given the opportunity. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.